He grew up in Michigan, served in the Second World War, and was then elected to Congress. He served on the Warren Commission, which investigated President Kennedy's assassination. He rose through the ranks and became the House Republican leader. He was planning on retiring when he was appointed vice president by President Nixon at the resignation of Spiro Agnew. He assumed the presidency when Nixon resigned, becoming the only president to never have been elected president or vice president. He soon issued a controversial pardon to President Nixon. His brief presidency saw the collapse of South Vietnam and an ongoing economic recession. He was challenged in the Republican primary by Ronald Reagan, and the race went all the way to the convention, but he prevailed. He then went on to lose the general election to Jimmy Carter. He retired to California and remained active, developing a close friendship with President Carter. He is our nation's 38th chief executive, Gerald R. Ford. Now let's take a look on a map at some sites associated with Gerald R. Ford. Ford was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and his birth name was Leslie King Jr. He was named after his father. His parents were divorced when he was a baby, and his mother moved to Michigan. But if you go to Omaha today, you can see the site where Ford was born. There's a little memorial there and a small garden on the birth site. Ford grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and if you go there today, that is the site of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. The Gerald Ford Presidential Library is actually in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is over here. And there's a reason that those are in separate cities, so it's the only site in the presidential library system run by the National Archives where the library and the museum are in separate cities. So Ford, of course, had an unusual path to the presidency. He had been the House Republican leader, or the minority leader in the House, for quite a number of years, and he planned on retiring after the 1974 elections. He had promised the university there at Ann Arbor his congressional papers, and that's the reason that all of his papers are there and that the presidential library is there. But of course, the town he grew up in was Grand Rapids, and it made sense for the presidential museum to be in Grand Rapids. Let's take a look at one other map. This is a map of California, and we're going to look at Rancho Mirage, California, which is right about here. And that's where the Fords lived after he retired from the presidency. They built a house there and lived there in their retirement. That's where President Ford died in 2006. And that house is privately owned and is not open to the public. Now let's take a look at some photographs of these locations. Now let's take a look at some books in my library relating to Gerald R. Ford. This is a book by Jerry Terhorst, who was President Ford's first press secretary, and he actually resigned in protest at the pardon of President Nixon. And he wrote a book chronicling Ford's life, his career in Congress, his appointment as vice president, and then his succession to the presidency. It's called Gerald Ford and the Future of the Presidency, and it was published in 1974. This is a book by Bob Woodward that was published in 1999, and it follows the lingering effects of the Watergate scandal and how it impacted the presidents that came after. It's called Shadow: 5 Presidents and the Legacy of Watergate. Here's a great book that was published in 2018. It's by Lisa McCubbin, and it's called Betty Ford, First Lady, Women's Advocate, Survivor, Trailblazer. So it's a full biography of Betty Ford, covers her whole life. A lot of time is given to Betty Ford's addiction to prescription drugs and the way her family confronted her about it and helped her to overcome that addiction, and of course the founding of the Betty Ford Center. So that's a very interesting part of the book, but the whole book is an interesting read. And here's another biography of an important figure in this era. It's by Richard Norton Smith, who is the great historian and director of a couple of presidential libraries in the past. It's On His Own Terms, A Life of Nelson Rockefeller. And it chronicles his career, his life in New York State politics, gives a lot of attention to the 1964 battle for the presidential nomination with the backers of Rockefeller and the backers of the much more conservative Barry Goldwater, his divorce and remarriage, and of course, he was appointed vice president by President Ford. It's my understanding that Richard Norton Smith is in the process of writing a biography of Gerald R. Ford, so I definitely look forward to that. And another good book by a photographer, in this case it's Diana Walker, who was a photographer for Time magazine, but it covers all of the presidents from Gerald Ford to Bill Clinton. It's called Public and Private, 20 Years Photographing the Presidency. And it has a lot of great photos from inside the White House and other places covering each of these presidencies. Our next episode will take a look at our nation's 39th president, Jimmy Carter.